All right. We're standing here on the corner of Lafayette and Astor Place. This was the very southern end of what was called Ladies Mile in the late 1800s. The department store is located between 8th and 23rd Street. Where the Kmart is right now was the Wanamaker store, and behind it, where the apartment building is now, was A.T. Stewart's store, which took up the entire block. Alexander Stewart opened his first store in 1823 downtown across from City Hall Park. In the 1840s, opened a bigger store right on Chambers Street, then moved up here in the 1860s with the others. He was one of the wealthiest men in New York, right up there with the Astors and the Vanderbilts. And after he died in 1878, he was buried in St. Mark's Cemetery, where we just were. Shortly thereafter, his body was removed, stolen straight out of St. Mark's Cemetery. The kidnappers demanded a ransom of $250,000. The distraught widow got the help of a friend to negotiate with the kidnappers. They offered to go for $200,000. The widow said, "Let's go for it." The friend said, "No, I think I can do better." It took 2 years, but he got him down to $20,000. Recovered the body and reinterred it in a cemetery in Queens, supposedly with bells attached in case somebody else tried the same stunt. But legend has it that before it was brought to the new cemetery, they actually had it in the basement of the department store here on 10th Street for a few days. And during that period, the clerks used to complain about Stewart looking over their shoulder while they were trying to do their work. And now we're standing in front of the former Astor Library, which was built in 1854. John Jacob Astor died in 1848, left a huge sum of money for the founding of this public library, one of the first in New York City, although it was not a lending library like the main branch today. It was for research only. There was limited access to the stacks. In fact, there was no access at all, basically. And one of his associates, a man named Joseph Green Cogswell, became the superintendent of the library, and he was a live-in librarian. And he heard these noises down the stacks. So he went down to investigate and saw a familiar figure, a businessman named Austin Sands. And he confronted Mr. Sands and said, "What are you doing here? You never even came here when you were alive." Sands had no answer for that, so he just walked through a wall. This happened 3 days. He couldn't get any sleep because of this constant interruptions. Finally, the third night, knowing that Sands was an inveterate cheapskate, came downstairs, saw the ghost, and said, "Listen, Sands," basically, I'm not doing the 1840s accent here, but listen, this can't keep going on. You can start paying me overtime. Sands disappeared and was not seen again since then. The building itself in the 1920s became the Hebrew Aid Society. And then in the 1960s, Joseph Papp took it over as for the public theater. We got the Shakespeare connection going on again. And he wasn't too happy about it at first, but he got used to it because he comes here all the time now, even though he's been dead for quite some time. And occasionally, Mr. Sands, who's not going to pass up any free show, is also seen in the balcony here.
Very good. Onward. Okay. All right, Andy, you're going to talk about the Merchants Museum, is that correct?
Yeah, so the Merchants House, as it's known now, it's referring to the profession of the owner. The owner was a man named Seabury Treadwell, and he bought this place way back in 1834 and lived here with his wife and daughters, and that family lived in this house for about 100 years. And they saw this neighborhood go from what was initially in the 1830s one of the most fashionable, wealthiest neighborhoods in New York, then later commercialized and became chopped up into small apartments and stores, bars, and restaurants, and then later became an abandoned industrial district with only this family still hanging on, all the way into 1934.
Wow.
Now, Seabury Treadwell was, like a lot of rich New Yorkers, a man who made his money in the shipping industry, and he was a striver. He had come from very poor origins and was determined to see a better life for his daughters, but he was a bit too controlling and demanding. No one was ever good enough for him. He had actually 6 daughters. 3 of them managed to get married, which is to say they managed to get away. The other 3 were not so lucky, and that was Emma, Gertrude, and Susan. And all of them really come to not a great end. None of them were able to marry. It's said that Henry James's story, Washington Square, is really based on this family, talking about another neighborhood that was a nice neighborhood at that time, but really about this father who had too much control over his daughters. Now, the saddest story is really with Susan. She was the youngest of the three sisters, and apparently, the details are a little sketchy. She had met a young man who not only was courting her, but also was having relations with her, and she became pregnant. And not only did the father say, well, you're not going to marry this guy, he demanded that she get rid of the child. Now, whether this was through an abortion, which was illegal at the time, but done, or whether the other story is that when the baby was born, the father killed it and buried it in the basement, we're not quite sure. But Susan herself claimed she could still hear the baby crying, and it finally drove her to take her own life. In this house. And many of the people who worked here have seen apparitions of the various sisters at various times. And what people have seen, they rarely go into the basement, but they see her still searching through the basement, searching through the child. Now, people have looked through the basement. They have not found a body of an infant, but that doesn't mean it wasn't put there and removed later. And I know once doing this tour, I had a customer, we were walking away, and she came up to me nervously, said, I heard the baby crying. I was like, what, now? No, she had been here a couple of years before. She was in here to look at the furniture and all the nice things in here, because this is a wonderfully preserved house, because they didn't throw anything away, so they made it a little museum. But she, and her husband confirmed this, she kept saying, I hear this baby crying. He couldn't hear it. He looked a little ashen to hear, because they hadn't heard this story till I told it to them. So it was no pre-suggestion. She was really hearing the baby. Now, the other sisters became basically old maids. Then one day, Emma slipped on the stairs, and the people who work in here said that's still a cold spot. That's not part of the house that's open to the public, but they say you walk there, you just feel a little colder, a little more nervous. There's a little bad energy on that very spot. And the last one was Gertrude, and she hung on until 1934, sometimes taking in boarders. She wasn't a complete hermit, but she lived on with all the stuff her father brought her to attract the suitors that he could never approve of into the days. And apparently she is still there to this day. From the time they were setting this place up as a museum, this was in the late 30s, a woman was cataloging the clothing, and she looked up and saw Gertrude wearing a dress she had not cataloged yet. She thought, what's going on? And then later in deep storage she found that dress. Apparently it was Gertrude's favorite, and when she became old she put it in a very special place. They didn't find it till the end. She's still there. Now people asked, well, shouldn't he be sending in the Ghostbusters, because this is really one of the most psychically active houses in New York. These truly trapped souls are still here. They've been investigating for about 4 years now. They haven't found anything really conclusive, but I know the people who work here, they've all have accounts of very strange things that happen in here.
Do you find that on the tours that people offer up anecdotes of their past in New York?
That's happened. You know, we had, like I mentioned, the woman mentioning that, but other people talk about experiences they've had. And yeah, a lot of these people who come on these tours, they're believers. They've had experiences of their own. Some of them have had experiences with some of the ghosts we talk about, like in that particular case. So yeah, that happens a lot.
Okay, we're on to our final destination, which is Bond Street, correct?
Yes, right. 31 Bond.
All right. All right, Doug, we are at 31 Bond Street, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, now that's reconstructed from the old days. The old 31 Bond Street looked actually very much like 33 Bond, and we have a lot of pictures because of what happened there. But I first became aware of it because a friend of mine, she worked in an office there some years ago, and she reported that there was this strange presence in the office, this sort of angry presence. But strangely, this only seemed to be picked up by the women who worked in the office. The men who worked there never saw anything. Now, she was not aware of the history of the place, but what happened at 31 Bond Street is an incident that was described for a time as the crime of the century in New York City. Now, there was a dentist named Dr. Harvey Burdell. Dentist of some note. He had published a book on dental diseases, so he had a little bit of a name for himself, and had come to this neighborhood looking to get some of the better trade. Now, this neighborhood was already starting to decline, and many of the old houses were breaking up into smaller apartments. That was the case here. He took an apartment in this building and also set up a dental office. But he also took up with the landlady of the house, a woman named Emma Cunningham. Now, she was a widow, which in those days meant probably your husband left. After 7 years, you could say he was dead and get on with your life as best you could, which was tough. And she had 2 children that was left to her by this missing husband. So things were very tough indeed. But she started a relationship with Dr. Burdell, a relationship that apparently was accompanied with promises from him of marriage. And she was very much under the assumption that she was going to get married and started to act accordingly. Now, she also apparently became pregnant and went to him with the ultimatum that, look, we have to get married. He gave her a different ultimatum, said, I'm getting rid of that kid. Now, he apparently performed an abortion on her. This was against the law, but he knew how to do it, and he forced her to undergo it. Now, she didn't tell anyone about this. In fact, she was still telling people she was going to have the child. And what happened was one day a messenger goes into the dental office and finds Dr. Harvey Burdell lying in a pool of his own blood. His head severed with a straight razor so severely it almost took off his head. Now, the police cornered Ms. Cunningham and actually held her in the place for about 2 days trying to get a confession out of her. They did get some sort of confession out of her, but this also drew the attention of a lawyer of the time. There was a crusading lawyer of a patrician background named Henry Clinton. And he had heard about how she was being held there and thought that's not the way you do things. So he decided to take her case pro bono. Now, he was going up against another lawyer, an Abraham Oakey Hall. He was the district attorney at the time, and he was affiliated with a little club called Tammany Hall. And he was looking for a nice sensational case that he could win because he was hoping to become mayor, which he did become. But the case hinged on the fact that Emma Cunningham was claiming that they had gotten married and she had a certificate of marriage, but it had this very clumsily written signature that looked frankly fake. So people were saying, no, you and some other friend of yours, you're going to try to get his estate. Well, the thing is, Clinton did some research and found out there was another certificate of marriage with the proper signature on it. And as best we can construct, what was happening was that Dr. Harvey Burdell was secretly buying up property in Emma Cunningham's name and was apparently going to get rid of her and then say, well, I'm married to her and I inherit her property. This was a lot of marshland out in Elizabeth, New Jersey, in a spot we now call Newark Airport. Not a bad investment, though. It would have taken a while to mature. So with the document of marriage, they were basically able to dismiss the charges, and she was even able to get a portion of his inheritance. Now, they were both buried out in Greenwood Cemetery, rather close to each other, but then they were supposed to be married. It was only a few years ago they actually got proper headstones. The headstone on Emma Cunningham's grave does say, God rest her troubled soul. There is no such epitaph on Dr. Harvey Burdell's, and apparently his rather troubled soul may still be lurking there and still very angry at any sort of woman he comes across to this day.
Interesting. Now, I have a final question for you. What do you think? Is it a fascination with death? Is it a morbid curiosity? Or is it kind of a kitschy entertainment value that brings people to these types of tours?
I think it's the idea that when we move through this world, it leaves something behind. And that's the thing. I don't know what ghosts really are, but I think often there is, when you have a certain emotional investment in a place, you leave some echo of yourself behind. I think that's what happens in places like the Merchant House and in McSorley's and in places like 31 Bond. That even though the buildings get changed around and the neighborhood changes in many ways, that energy of people who lived their past, people who had very heavy traumatic moments in their lives, that those moments are still echoing in those stones to this very day.